Welcome back to Revenge Room. If you're new here, hit subscribe because this channel is where betrayal meets consequence, and today's story might be the most powerful one I've ever told. The title is, At Christmas Dinner, I Overheard My Daughter-in-Law Plotting to Move Her Family into My $380K Home. Picture this. Christmas Eve, the smell of roasted turkey, a family gathered around the table, and a father who spent 40 years building bridges, saving every penny, sacrificing everything for his only son. That condo worth $380,000 was supposed to be his peace, his retirement, his reward. But while he was in the kitchen getting more wine, he heard something that stopped his heart. His daughter-in-law, the woman he welcomed into his family, was calmly explaining to her parents how they would all move into his home. Not asking, planning. And the worst part, his own son sat there in silence, saying nothing. He won't say no, she laughed. He never does. She was right about one thing. He didn't say no. He smiled. He nodded. He let them measure his rooms, pack his belongings into a corner, and throw a party in his living room like he was already gone. What she didn't know was that his late wife had left him something. A letter, a secret, and a weapon she never saw coming. 89 missed calls, one sold house, and a twist in this story that will completely change everything you think you know about his son. Stay with me until the end, because this is not just about revenge. This is about a father who chose dignity over destruction, and the moment an entire family realized they had underestimated the wrong man. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades designing bridges and highways across the Midwest. I built things that lasted, structures meant to stand long after I was gone. I never imagined that the thing I could not build was a family that would stand by me. That Christmas Eve started with hope. I woke early before the sun crept over the mountains and began preparing the dinner I had dreamed about for months. Turkey with my late wife's herb stuffing recipe, mashed potatoes with roasted garlic, the apple pie she used to make every year, the one I had finally learned to bake myself after 3 failed attempts. I wanted everything perfect. It had been 2 years since the whole family gathered under one roof, and I thought maybe this was our chance to reconnect, to remember what we meant to each other. The condo smelled like rosemary and butter by mid-morning. I set the table with the good china, the set Maggie and I received as a wedding gift 43 years ago. I even polished the silver, something I had not done since she passed. As I worked, I caught myself glancing at her photograph on the mantel. She smiled back at me the way she always did, patient and knowing. I could almost hear her voice. She always handled the paperwork, she used to say. She told me I trusted too easily, that my kindness would get me in trouble someday. I never believed her. I thought she was being cautious. Maybe even a little cynical. Standing in that kitchen, smoothing the tablecloth she had picked out 20 years ago, I still did not believe her. That was my first mistake. The condo was worth $380,000. It represented everything I had worked for, every extra shift, every delayed vacation, every sacrifice made so that one day I could rest. Maggie and I bought it together when I retired, imagining quiet mornings and long walks and grandchildren running through the halls. She only got 3 years in this place before the cancer took her. Now it was just me rattling around in rooms too big for one person, holding on to memories that lived in every corner. My son Daniel arrived first with his wife Lauren and their 2 children. I hugged him at the door, holding on perhaps a moment too long. He pulled back with a tight smile, his eyes sliding away from mine the way they always did lately. Lauren swept past with a quick nod, already on her phone, directing the children toward the living room like a general deploying troops. Behind them came her family, her father Richard, a broad man with a firm handshake and louder voice, her mother Elaine, all silk scarves and practiced warmth, her younger brother Jason, who carried himself with the restless energy of someone always looking for the next opportunity. Dinner started well enough, compliments on the food, laughter about old memories, the kind of surface conversation that fills the silence without saying much. But as the meal went on, I noticed the talk kept turning in one direction. Jason leaned forward, eyes bright, describing what he called investment potential and untapped equity. Richard nodded eagerly at every word, adding comments about prime locations and smart moves. They talked about business headquarters and development opportunities, phrases that floated over my head like clouds I could not quite catch. I smiled and nodded, assuming they were discussing some project of their own. I didn't realize they were discussing mine. The truth came later when I stepped into the kitchen to fetch more wine. The door was half open, and I heard Lauren's voice, clear and confident, cutting through the quiet. She was talking to Daniel, though it sounded more like she was instructing him. She explained that her parents would take the master bedroom, Jason would use the guest room as his office, the children would share the smaller room in the back. She had it all planned out, every detail arranged like furniture in a showroom. My name was not mentioned, my opinion was not considered. I was simply expected to step aside, to disappear into whatever corner they had left for me. Daniel said nothing. I waited, holding my breath, praying he would speak up. He just stood there, eyes on the floor, his phone face down on the counter like he was hiding something. Lauren laughed softly. "He won't say no," she said. "He never does." I stood frozen in that doorway, wine bottle growing warm in my hand, feeling something crack inside my chest. That was the moment I realized they were not asking for permission. They were issuing an eviction notice for my own life. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me, the creaks and sighs of a home that suddenly felt like foreign territory. My guests had retired to their rooms hours ago, Lauren directing everyone with quiet efficiency while I cleaned the kitchen alone. No one offered to help, no one asked if I was all right. I was already invisible to them, a ghost haunting my own halls. The anger came first, hot and sharp, urging me to march down the corridor and demand answers. I wanted to shake Daniel by the shoulders and ask what had happened to the boy I raised. I wanted to look Lauren in the eye and tell her this was my home, my life, my decision. But somewhere in the darkness between midnight and dawn, I heard Maggie's voice. Not a memory exactly, more like a feeling that took the shape of words. She used to say that reacting without understanding was like pouring concrete before checking the foundation. You end up with a mess that takes twice as long to fix. Don't react until you understand the full picture, she would tell me whenever I came home frustrated from work. Silence isn't surrender, it's reconnaissance. I turned that word over in my mind, reconnaissance. It was a military term, but it applied to engineering too. Before you build anything, you survey the land, you test the soil. You look for weaknesses that might cause problems later. Lying there in the dark, I realized that was exactly what I needed to do. Lauren had revealed her plan, but she had not revealed everything. There were pieces missing, motivations I did not understand, weaknesses I had not yet identified. If I confronted her now, she would simply adjust her approach. She would find another angle, another way to get what she wanted. But if I stayed quiet, if I watched and listened, she might show me exactly where her foundation was cracked. I thought about Lauren carefully, the way I used to think about a difficult project. She was intelligent, there was no denying that. She had climbed her way up in a competitive career, managed a household with military precision, and somehow convinced my son that her word was law. But intelligence often comes with blind spots, and Lauren's was obvious to anyone paying attention. She underestimated people. Specifically, she underestimated anyone she considered beneath her, and that category included the elderly. To her, I was not a man who had spent 40 years solving complex problems. I was just an old father who had outlived his usefulness, an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected. That arrogance was a crack in her foundation. I just needed to figure out how to use it. The next morning I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table before anyone else woke up. My mind drifted to an old friend, someone I had not spoken to in years, but whose number I still knew by heart. Samuel Brooks. Sam and I built bridges together for 3 decades across the Midwest, working side by side through brutal winters and impossible deadlines. He was the kind of man who said little but meant everything he said. After he retired from engineering, he went back to school and became a lawyer specializing in real estate. We used to joke that he went from building physical bridges to building legal ones. I made a mental note to call him soon. Not yet, but soon. When I had more information, when I understood what I was truly dealing with. After breakfast, while the house buzzed with activity and the Millers discussed their plans in the living room as if I were not there, I slipped into the small office Maggie had claimed as her own. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender and vanilla, a scent that made my chest tighten every time I entered. Her desk sat by the window, neat and organized exactly as she had left it. I opened the top drawer looking for nothing in particular, just wanting to feel close to her. That was when I found the envelopes. There were 5 of them, all sealed, all addressed in Maggie's careful handwriting. 3 were for me, marked with dates stretching back several years. 1 was for Daniel. And one placed slightly apart from the others as if she had hesitated before leaving it, there was addressed to Lauren. I held that envelope for a long moment, turning it over in my hands, wondering what my wife could possibly have wanted to say to my daughter-in-law. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, but something stopped me. Maggie had sealed these letters for a reason. She had placed them here knowing I would find them eventually. Whatever wisdom they contained, she wanted me to discover it at the right time. I put the envelopes back in the drawer and closed it gently. Not yet, I told myself. Not until I need them. I returned to the living room and took my usual seat in the corner. Lauren glanced at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, then continued explaining her renovation ideas to her mother. I nodded along, agreeable and quiet, the harmless old man they expected me to be. They mistook my silence for surrender. But an engineer knows you measure twice before you cut once. The holiday guests departed the next morning in a flurry of suitcases and half-hearted goodbyes. Lauren orchestrated the exit with the same efficiency she brought to everything, herding children into car seats and issuing instructions to her parents about the drive home. I stood on the porch, waving like a dutiful host, playing my part in this little theater we had constructed. Only Daniel lingered, standing by his car, with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking everywhere except at me. I walked over to him, hoping for something. A word of explanation, perhaps, or an apology, or even just acknowledgement that he understood what his wife had done. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, eyes fixed on the pavement, on the bare trees, on the clouds drifting overhead. Anywhere but my face. I waited. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, I asked him simply if everything was all right. He nodded quickly, too quickly, and muttered something about traffic and needing to get on the road. Then he climbed into the car where Lauren sat waiting, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. I watched them drive away and felt something hollow open up in my chest. This was not the first time my son had disappointed me. It was not even the worst. Standing there in the cold December air, I found myself thinking about what happened 10 years ago, a memory I had buried so deep I almost forgot it existed. Daniel had called me in a panic that year, his voice cracking with fear. His business had failed. He had borrowed money from the wrong people, made promises he could not keep, and now creditors were circling like vultures. He needed $50,000 immediately, or he would lose everything. His house, his credit, his future. I didn't hesitate. I took out a loan against the condo, the home Maggie and I had saved our entire lives to buy, and transferred the money to his account the same day. I never told Maggie the full extent of the risk. I just handled it quietly the way fathers do. Daniel never thanked me, not once. When I brought it up months later, he shrugged and said that parents are supposed to help their children. It was my duty, he explained, as if I owed him the security I had spent 40 years building. I let it go. I told myself he was stressed that gratitude would come later when the dust settled. It never did. The dust settled, life moved on, and the debt between us was simply erased from his memory while it remained carved into mine. But that was not the worst of it. The worst came a few weeks after that desperate phone call when I was organizing files for tax season and found a bank statement I did not recognize. It was from a joint account Maggie and I had opened years earlier, one we rarely used, intended as an emergency fund for the family. Someone had withdrawn $15,000 from that account using my signature. Except, I had never signed anything. I stared at that document for a long time, comparing the signature to my own, noting the slight tremor in the letters, the way the S curved just a little too sharply. It was a forgery, a careful one, but a forgery nonetheless, and there was only one person who had access to that account and knew my signature well enough to fake it. I never confronted Daniel. I do not know why. Maybe I could not bear to hear him deny it, or worse, admit it without remorse. Maybe I was afraid of what it would mean for our relationship, for Maggie, for the fragile peace our family maintained. So I buried the statement at the bottom of a drawer and pretended I never saw it. I forgave him in silence for a sin he never confessed. Looking back now, I realize that might have been my greatest mistake. I taught my son that betrayal had no consequences. I showed him that my love was unconditional, that he could take, and I would keep giving. No wonder Lauren thought I would simply hand over my home. Daniel had already proven that his father would sacrifice anything and ask for nothing in return. The house felt emptier than usual after everyone left. I was locking the front door when I noticed a small piece of paper on the entry table, folded and crumpled as if someone had been squeezing it nervously. I picked it up and recognized Daniel's handwriting, hurried and slanted. The note contained only a single line. "Check your old email," it said, "the one Mom used to send you recipes." I frowned at the words, trying to make sense of them. That email account had been dormant for years. I stopped logging in after Maggie died because every message from her felt like a wound reopening. The thought of going back there, of seeing her name in my inbox, was more than I could bear. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket without thinking much about it. Probably nothing. Probably just Daniel being strange. I went to bed that night feeling older than my 68 years. The pillows still smelled faintly of Maggie's shampoo, a scent I had tried to preserve long past the point of reason. I pressed my face into the fabric and let the grief wash over me, familiar and heavy. Losing my wife broke my heart. Losing my son broke my faith. But I was not broken yet. They came back 2 weeks later, all of them arriving in a caravan of vehicles that filled my driveway like an occupying force. I watched from the window as Richard emerged first, stretching his back and surveying the property with the critical eye of a man appraising livestock. Elaine followed, clutching her purse and already frowning at the landscaping. Jason bounded out of his car with a tablet in hand, fingers swiping across the screen before his feet even touched the ground. Lauren and Daniel arrived last, the children tumbling out in a blur of noise and energy, while their mother issued commands about staying out of certain rooms. No one had called ahead to ask if this visit was convenient. No one considered that I might have plans or preferences or any say in the matter at all. They simply appeared, and I was expected to accommodate them. I opened the door with a smile I did not feel, and welcomed them into my home for what Lauren cheerfully described as a quick walkthrough. Richard wasted no time. He moved through the condo like a building inspector, running his hands along walls and peering into closets with undisguised evaluation. He carried a small measuring tape and pulled it out repeatedly, stretching it across doorways and windows while muttering numbers under his breath. In the master bedroom, the room where Maggie took her last breath, he stood in the center and nodded slowly. "Not bad for a starter," he announced to no one in particular. "We will need to knock down this wall to expand the suite, maybe add an ensuite bathroom with a walk-in shower. The current layout is too cramped for comfortable living." I stood in the doorway listening to him redesign the space where my wife died, and I said nothing. I just watched and remembered. Jason was even more brazen. He photographed everything, every room, every angle, every detail. He talked constantly about renovation budgets and equity potential, throwing around numbers as if the condo were already his to improve. He mentioned contractors he knew, materials he could get at discount timelines for transforming what he called this dated space into something with real market value. At one point, he asked me how old the appliances were, not out of curiosity but calculation. When I told him, he winced and typed something into his tablet. "That will need to go immediately," he said. "No point keeping anything that drags down the appraisal. Not once did anyone ask my opinion. Not once did anyone acknowledge that this was my home filled with my memories paid for with my labor. I was furniture to them, an inconvenient piece of the old decor that would eventually be removed and forgotten." Elaine found me in the kitchen while the others continued their inspection. She approached with the soft smile of someone about to deliver a difficult truth, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "Thomas," she began, placing a hand on my arm with theatrical tenderness. "Family helps family. You understand that, don't you?" She explained that her grandchildren needed stability, a good school district room to grow. She talked about how difficult the economy had been, how expensive housing costs were for young families these days. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "You wouldn't want to be selfish, would you? Think about what Maggie would have wanted. She would have wanted you to put family first." The mention of my wife's name in her mouth made my stomach turn. Elaine did not know Maggie. She had met her perhaps 3 times over the years, brief encounters at holidays where polite smiles masked mutual indifference. To invoke her now to use her memory as a weapon against me was a cruelty so casual it took my breath away. But I simply nodded and told her I understood. She patted my arm and walked away, satisfied that she had done her duty. The inspection continued for another hour. I drifted through my own home like a visitor watching strangers claim territory that was not theirs to claim. Then Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened instantly. He stepped outside onto the porch, but the window was open and I heard every word. "I told you not to call me about that," he hissed into the phone, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "We are handling it. Do not contact me again until I say so." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, jaw-clenched, hands balled into fists at his sides. When he came back inside, Lauren watched him with something flickering in her eyes. It looked almost like fear. Neither of them said a word about the call, and I filed that detail away for later. By the time they left, the sun was setting and my home no longer felt like mine. They had walked through every room, touched every surface, planned every change. They had divided my life into square footage and renovation costs without ever asking if I agreed. I stood alone in the living room as their cars disappeared down the street, surrounded by walls that suddenly felt like a prison. I was still alive, but already erased from their blueprint. They had divided my home before I had even left it. The moving boxes arrived 3 days later. I had not ordered them. I had not agreed to anything. But there they were, stacked in my living room, like cardboard monuments to my obsolescence, delivered by a service Lauren had apparently arranged without consulting me. She followed shortly after, letting herself in with a key I did not remember giving her, and began directing operations with the brisk efficiency of someone clearing out a storage unit. "You don't need all this space anymore, Dad," she said without looking at me. "One room is plenty for someone your age." She gestured toward the small guest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with the single window that faced the parking lot. "That would be my new domain," she explained. "Cozy and manageable. The master bedroom would go to her parents. The second bedroom would become Jason's home office. The children would take the room with the nice view, the one where morning light streamed through and made everything feel alive." My protests died in my throat before they could form. What was the point? She had already decided. The afternoon became a blur of bubble wrap and packing tape. Lauren moved through my belongings with casual authority, sorting my life into categories. Keep, donate, discard. She held up items I had treasured for decades and asked if I really needed them, her tone suggesting the answer was obviously no. A collection of engineering journals from my early career went into the donate pile. Framed photographs that did not fit her decorating vision were wrapped and boxed for storage. She found Maggie's old recipe books in the kitchen and hesitated for just a moment before setting them aside. "These might be worth something to a collector," she murmured, more to herself than to me. I watched her discuss paint colors with her mother over the phone, debating between something called agreeable gray and a shade called modern farmhouse white. She walked through rooms, pointing at walls, describing where furniture would go, how the flow would improve once certain pieces were removed. My recliner, the one Maggie bought me for my 60th birthday, was apparently too bulky for the new aesthetic. It would need to be sold or donated. She talked about my home as if I were not standing 3 feet away, as if I had already vacated the premises and left only my ghost behind. Throughout the afternoon, Lauren kept checking her phone. Not casual glances, but urgent, anxious looks, her brow furrowing each time she read something on the screen. She exchanged several loaded glances with Daniel, silent communications that excluded everyone else in the room. At one point, I asked if everything was all right, if there was something I should know about. She snapped at me with unexpected sharpness. "Everything is fine," she said, her voice tight. "Just busy. Work things. You wouldn't understand." Daniel looked away when I tried to catch his eye, suddenly fascinated by the texture of the carpet. Something was happening between them, some private worry they were carefully hiding. At the time, I assumed it was marriage trouble, perhaps an affair or financial stress. The truth I would later learn was far more desperate than I imagined. Daniel behaved strangely all afternoon. He said little, following Lauren's instructions with mechanical obedience, but I noticed small things that did not quite fit. At one point, he placed his phone on a bookshelf, positioning it carefully, with the screen facing outward toward where Lauren stood directing the packing. His hand trembled slightly as he set it down, a fine vibration I might have missed if I had not been watching so closely. He stepped back and busied himself with a box, but his eyes kept darting to that phone, checking its position, making sure it had not moved. I thought it was guilt. I thought he could not bear to look at what his wife was doing to his father, and so he distracted himself with small tasks. I thought he was ashamed, but too weak to speak up. I was wrong about almost everything, but I would not understand that until much later. By evening, my life had been compressed into a single corner of the guest room, boxes stacked against walls, furniture crowded together without logic or care. Lauren surveyed the results with evident pride, hands on her hips, nodding at a job well done. She reminded me that her parents would arrive next week to begin settling in and that I should try to stay out of the way during the transition period. She said it kindly, the way one might speak to a child or a very old dog. Then she gathered her things and left Daniel trailing behind her like a shadow. I sat alone in that cramped room, surrounded by the artifacts of my existence, cardboard boxes pressing in from every side. The walls felt closer than before, the ceiling lower, the air thinner. They had packed my life while I watched folding 68 years into containers that could be stacked and stored and eventually forgotten. But I was packing something too. I was gathering evidence with every observation, cataloging every slight and every tell. I was cultivating patience like a crop that would one day yield a harvest they never expected. And somewhere beneath the hurt and the humiliation, I was nurturing the last shred of hope that my son might still be in there somewhere, buried under the weight of his wife's ambition, waiting for a chance to break free. Sleep refused to come that night. I lay in the narrow guest bed surrounded by towers of boxes, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a room that had never been mine. The ceiling had a small crack I had never noticed before, a thin line running from the light fixture toward the window like a river on a map leading nowhere. I traced it with my eyes for hours, thinking about everything and nothing until the darkness outside began to soften into gray. By dawn, I knew what I needed to do. I had been avoiding Maggie's desk since Christmas, circling around it like a man afraid to look directly at the sun. But the envelopes were waiting. They had been waiting for years, patient and silent, holding whatever wisdom my wife had left behind. If there was ever a time to open them, it was now. I made coffee first, a ritual that bought me a few more minutes of hesitation. Then I walked to the small office and sat in Maggie's chair, feeling the familiar contours of the seat that had molded to her shape over decades of use. The drawer slid open with a whisper. The envelopes lay exactly where I had left them, 5 sealed messages from a woman who knew me better than I knew myself. I selected the one with the earliest date, addressed simply to Ray in her careful handwriting, and held it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside, I found 2 items. The first was a letter written on the pale blue stationery Maggie used for important correspondence. The second was a thick stack of legal documents bound with a rubber band. I set the documents aside and unfolded the letter, her familiar script swimming before my eyes as I began to read. Ray, she had written, if you are reading this, someone is trying to take what is ours. I knew this day might come. I hoped it never would, but hope is not a strategy. You always said that about engineering, and I learned it applies to life as well. She went on to remind me of Barbara, our neighbor from 20 years ago. Barbara had been a widow like Maggie would become, living alone in a house she had shared with her husband for 40 years. Her daughter-in-law had convinced her to add names to the deed for convenience for estate planning, for reasons that sounded sensible at the time. Within 2 years, Barbara was living in a nursing home she did not need, and strangers occupied the house where she had raised her children. I visited her once before she passed. The look in her eyes haunted me, Ray. It was the look of someone who trusted the wrong people and paid for it with everything she had. Maggie's letter continued. I swore that would never happen to us. I swore that no one would take our home through manipulation or legal tricks or the slow erosion of your generous heart. You're a good man, Ray, too good sometimes. You believe the best in people, even when they show you the worst. It is one of the things I love most about you, and it is also your greatest vulnerability. So I took steps. I hope you will forgive me for not telling you sooner. I did not want to worry you or make you think I doubted our family. But some protections are better built quietly, like foundations poured before anyone knows a structure is being planned. I set the letter down and reached for the legal documents with trembling hands. The top page bore the heading, Revocable Living Trust, followed by dense paragraphs of legal language that swam before my eyes. But certain phrases leaped out clearly. Sole trustee, sole beneficiary, property held in trust cannot be sold, transferred, mortgaged, or encumbered without the express written consent of the trustee. I flipped through the pages, finding Maggie's signature alongside that of a notary from 15 years ago. She had done this quietly, carefully, without ever mentioning it to me. She had built a fortress around our home and trusted that I would find the blueprints when I needed them most. I read through the documents 3 times, making sure I understood. The condo was protected. It belonged to the trust, and the trust belonged to me. Not Daniel, not Lauren. Not Richard or Elaine or Jason with his renovation fantasies. The only signature that mattered was mine, and I had signed nothing. All their plans, all their measurements and paint swatches and furniture arrangements meant nothing. They were decorating a house they had no legal claim to touch. As I returned the documents to their envelope, my eyes fell on the other letter, the one addressed to Lauren. It sat apart from the others, slightly thicker, sealed with the same careful attention Maggie brought to everything she did. I picked it up and felt its weight in my palm. Part of me wanted desperately to open it, to know what my wife had wanted to say to the woman who would one day try to push me out of my own home. How had Maggie known? What had she seen in Lauren all those years ago that I had missed? But I could not bring myself to break the seal. Maggie had addressed this letter to Lauren, not to me. She had a reason for everything she did, a purpose behind every decision. If she had wanted me to read these words, she would have written them in my envelope. Whatever message waited inside was meant for Lauren's eyes and Lauren's eyes alone. I put the envelope back in the drawer, but I didn't forget it. Some weapons are more powerful when held in reserve. I sat in Maggie's chair as morning light filled the room, legal documents in my lap, tears streaming down my face. My wife had protected me from beyond the grave. She had seen this coming when I was still blind, and she had built walls I never knew existed. But she had left something else too, a letter for the woman who would try to destroy me. I did not know what it said. I was not sure I ever would. I sat with those documents for the rest of the morning, reading and rereading every clause until the legal language began to feel familiar. Maggie had built something remarkable, a shield I never knew I was carrying. But a shield only works if you know how to use it. I needed professional confirmation that what I was seeing was real, that the protection was as solid as it appeared. I needed Samuel Brooks. The phone felt heavier than usual as I dialed the number I still knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, older than I remembered, but carrying the same steady calm that had guided us through countless difficult projects decades ago. "Sam," I said, and for a moment I couldn't continue. The weight of everything pressed down on my chest, making words difficult. There was a pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle of recognition. "Ray Whitmore," he said. "I was wondering when you would finally call. Maggie told me you would someday. She said I should be ready." That stopped me cold. Maggie had spoken to him. She had prepared him for this moment the same way she had prepared the documents, the same way she had prepared everything. Even from beyond the grave, my wife was still 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I asked Sam what exactly Maggie had told him, and he explained that she had consulted with him 15 years ago when establishing the trust. She wanted to make sure it was airtight, he said. She wanted to know every possible way someone might try to break it, and then she wanted those doors welded shut. "Your wife was a remarkable woman, Ray. She thought of everything." I explained what had happened since Christmas, the overheard conversation, the inspection, the boxes, the way Lauren had begun redecorating my home as if I had already departed. Sam listened without interrupting, asking only occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he spoke with the measured confidence of someone who knows exactly what he is talking about. "Ray, that trust is ironclad. You are the sole owner, period. They cannot touch it unless you sign it away yourself. No one can sell, transfer, mortgage, or encumber that property without your explicit written consent. Whatever plans your daughter-in-law has made, they are built on sand." Relief flooded through me, but I needed to understand the full picture. I asked about the Millers, about their assumption that they could simply move in and take over. Sam's response was immediate. "Here is the beautiful part," he said. "They never signed a lease. There is no rental agreement, no formal arrangement of any kind. In the eyes of the law, they are just guests who overstayed their welcome. You could ask them to leave tomorrow, and if they refused, you could have them removed. More importantly, you can sell that property whenever you want. They have no legal standing to stop you or even to be notified in advance." The implications settled over me slowly. I had spent weeks feeling powerless, watching my home be carved up and distributed like an estate after a death that had not yet occurred. But the power had been mine all along. Maggie had made sure of that. The question now was what to do with it. I made my decision quickly, the way I used to make decisions on job sites when delays cost money and hesitation caused problems. "List it," I told Sam. "Today, if possible, but quietly. I do not want them to know until it is done. I want the sale completed, the papers signed, and the new owners ready to take possession before anyone in that family realizes what has happened." Sam did not hesitate. He said he had contacts in real estate who specialized in discrete transactions. Properties could be listed without public advertising, shown only to pre-qualified buyers, and sold with minimal exposure. It might take a bit longer than a traditional sale, he warned, but it could absolutely be done. I told him longer was fine. I had waited this long. I could wait a little more. Before we ended the call, Sam mentioned one more thing. His voice took on a slightly different quality, curiosity mixed with caution. "Ray," he said, "when you first told me about this situation, something about the Miller family did not sit right with me. Call it professional instinct. So I ran a background check on all of them. Just basic public records, nothing invasive." He paused. It made for interesting reading. I asked what he had found, but he declined to share details over the phone. "Let us wait until escrow closes," he said. "It is not urgent information, just context that might help you understand what you are really dealing with. When the time is right, I will tell you everything." I agreed, though the curiosity gnawed at me. What had Sam discovered about the Millers? What secrets were hiding behind Richard's angry phone calls and Lauren's nervous glances? I filed the questions away for later. Right now, the priority was executing the plan. The listing went live that afternoon, visible only to a select network of buyers and agents who understood the need for discretion. Sam sent me a confirmation email with the details. The property was priced fairly, positioned to attract serious offers quickly. He estimated we would have a buyer within a few weeks and could close escrow within 2 months if everything went smoothly. I read that email sitting in Maggie's chair, surrounded by the documents she had left me, feeling something I had not felt in a long time. It was not happiness exactly, not yet. But it was hope. It was the sense that I was no longer a passenger in my own life, swept along by currents I could not control. I was the engineer again, designing an outcome following a blueprint my wife had drawn long ago. 7 weeks. That was all the time they had left in the house they thought they had already won. Lauren was probably at that very moment discussing furniture arrangements with her mother. Richard was probably measuring walls for his master suite. Jason was probably calculating equity gains on his tablet. None of them had any idea that the clock was ticking, that every day they spent planning their future in my home was one day closer to losing everything. And I smiled for the first time in weeks, alone in that quiet room, holding my wife's wisdom in my hands. 4 weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. The Millers came and went, continuing their preparations, discussing their plans in my presence as though I were furniture. I played my part perfectly, nodding along, offering no resistance, letting them believe they had already won. Meanwhile, Sam sent me weekly updates. The property had attracted interest immediately. 2 serious buyers had emerged within days, and by the 3rd week, we had an offer above asking price. A young couple relocating from out of state, eager to close quickly. We accepted, and escrow began its quiet countdown. The Millers had no idea. They were too busy planning a party. Lauren announced the housewarming with the same casual authority she brought to everything else. She framed it as a celebration of new beginnings, a chance to introduce their friends and neighbors to what she called their beautiful new home. Invitations went out to people I had never met. A caterer was hired. Furniture was rearranged to maximize flow. She even had flowers delivered, elaborate arrangements that filled rooms with fragrance and color. My home had never looked more elegant or felt less like mine. The party fell on a Saturday evening, 4 weeks and 3 days after the listing went live. Guests began arriving at 6, a steady stream of unfamiliar faces flowing through my front door. Lauren greeted each one with the warm confidence of a practiced hostess, accepting compliments on the decor and the location and the wonderful natural light. She guided tours through the rooms, pointing out features and plans, describing renovations that would never happen. Richard held court in the living room, a drink perpetually in his hand, telling stories about real estate and investment and the importance of seizing opportunities. Elaine circulated with practiced grace, touching arms and laughing at jokes, playing the role of gracious matriarch. Jason worked the room like a salesman, handing out business cards and discussing market trends with anyone who would listen. I was given a chair in the corner near the window, out of the way of foot traffic. Lauren had suggested I might be more comfortable there, away from the noise and crowds. She said it sweetly, with apparent concern for my well-being, but the message was clear. I was a relic being stored until disposal, an inconvenient reminder of the home's history that did not fit the narrative she was constructing. I accepted the chair without complaint. I even thanked her for her thoughtfulness. Then I sat and watched and waited, a cup of cold coffee growing colder in my hands. The evening wore on with toasts and laughter. Richard raised his glass and spoke about family and opportunity and the bright future ahead. Elaine dabbed at her eyes and talked about how wonderful it was to have everyone together. Jason made jokes about home improvement projects and equity appreciation. They clinked their glasses and drank to success, to prosperity, to the beautiful home that had fallen so conveniently into their laps. Not one of them mentioned my name or acknowledged my presence. I had become invisible in my own living room, a ghost at a party celebrating my disappearance. Halfway through the evening, I noticed Richard pull Elaine aside near the hallway. They spoke in low voices, heads bent together, expressions tight with worry that did not match the festive atmosphere. I could not hear everything, but fragments drifted across the room during a lull in the music. "If this does not work out," Richard muttered, his words slightly slurred from drink, "the hearing is in 3 weeks." Elaine gripped his arm and whispered something urgent in response. "It will work," she said. "It has to. We have no other options." They composed themselves quickly, pasting smiles back onto their faces, but I had seen the cracks beneath the surface. Something was wrong in the Miller family, something more than simple greed. I filed that observation away alongside all the others. One absence was conspicuous throughout the evening. Daniel had not come. Lauren explained to curious guests that her husband was working late, an important project that could not wait. She delivered this excuse smoothly, without hesitation, but I noticed the slight tension around her eyes when she said it. Working late on a Saturday during a family celebration seemed unlikely. I wondered where my son actually was and what he was doing that kept him from this triumphant event his wife had orchestrated. The answer came later that night, after the guests had departed, and I sat alone in my corner room surrounded by boxes. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief, just 7 words that made no immediate sense. "Don't give up on me yet, Dad." I stared at the screen for a long moment. It had to be a wrong number. Someone texting the wrong father, sending encouragement meant for someone else. I deleted the message and set the phone aside. But sleep was slow to come that night. Those words kept echoing in my mind, carrying a weight I could not quite explain. Don't give up on me yet. Part of me wanted to believe they were meant for me after all. The party had been a success by any measure. Lauren would spend the next few days accepting compliments and sharing photos. Richard would continue making plans for his master suite. The whole family would go on believing they had secured their future in a home that already belonged to someone else. But escrow was moving forward. The buyers had completed their inspection. Signatures were being gathered. In less than 3 weeks, the sale would close, and everything the Millers had celebrated would crumble to dust. They raised their glasses to a future that was already crumbling. And I smiled into my coffee, because sometimes the best revenge is simply waiting for people to hang themselves with their own arrogance. 3 more weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. I went through the motions of daily life, eating meals I barely tasted, sleeping in, fitful bursts, watching the calendar with the intensity of a man counting down to his own liberation. The Millers continued their occupation of my home, oblivious to the tectonic shift happening beneath their feet. Lauren finalized paint colors. Richard measured for custom blinds. Jason ordered business cards with my address printed beneath his name. They built their futures on a foundation that had already been sold out from under them, and I said nothing. I simply waited. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks to the day after Sam had listed the property. I was sitting in Maggie's office, surrounded by boxes I had not unpacked, when my phone rang with his familiar number. I answered before the second ring, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ray Sam said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "It is done. Escrow closed this morning. Congratulations, you are officially free." I had to ask him to repeat the words. They seemed too simple to carry such weight, too ordinary to mark the end of this chapter. But Sam confirmed everything. The sale had completed without complications. The young couple from out of state had wired their funds, signed their documents, and taken legal possession of the property. They planned to move in within 30 days, which meant the current occupants would need to vacate. A formal notice would be sent within 48 hours, singed by the new owner's attorney. Everything had been handled quietly, professionally, exactly as we had planned. The condo that Lauren had already redecorated in her mind now belonged to strangers she had never met. I thanked Sam with a voice that trembled more than I expected. He told me I was welcome, that it had been an honor to help, that Maggie would have been proud. Then his tone shifted slightly, taking on the careful quality I had learned to recognize over decades of friendship. "Ray," he said, "there is something else. Remember the background check I mentioned? I think it is time I shared what I found." What followed reframed everything I thought I understood about the Miller family. Sam spoke for nearly 20 minutes, laying out facts he had pieced together from public records, court filings, and financial documents. The picture that emerged was not what I had expected. Richard Miller's real estate development company had collapsed 2 years ago, brought down by a combination of bad investments, market shifts, and what appeared to be significant mismanagement. The failure had been catastrophic. They lost their primary residence, first a large home in a wealthy suburb that went to foreclosure when they could no longer make payments. Then the cars disappeared, traded for cheaper models, or sold outright. Retirement accounts were drained to cover mounting debts. Credit cards maxed out, then defaulted. The Miller family had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years, struggling to maintain appearances while their financial foundation crumbled to dust. But that was not the worst of it. Sam had discovered that Richard faced a foreclosure hearing in just 2 weeks for their last remaining assets, a small rental property they had managed to hold on to the final thread connecting them to their former prosperity. If that hearing went badly, and all indications suggested it would, the Millers would have nothing left. No home, no income, no safety net. They would be starting over from zero at an age when starting over felt impossible. The condo was never about greed, Sam explained. It was about survival. They saw your home as their only option, the only life raft in sight while their ship was sinking. It does not excuse what they did, Ray, but it explains the desperation. They were not just entitled, they were terrified. I sat in silence for a long time after Sam finished speaking. The information settled over me like a weight I had not anticipated, pressing down on the anger I had cultivated so carefully over the past 2 months. I thought about Lauren's obsessive phone, checking the nervous glances she exchanged with Daniel, the way Richard snapped at whoever called during the inspection. I thought about Elaine's whispered reassurance at the party. It will work. It has to. We have no other options. Those words took on new meaning now. They were not the words of greedy opportunists. They were the words of people facing ruin. But understanding did not equal forgiveness. I let that truth settle into my bones as I processed what Sam had told me. The Millers had been desperate, yes. Their situation was genuinely dire. But desperation did not justify what they had done to me. Fear did not excuse treating me like an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be respected. They had measured my worth in square footage. They had packed my belongings into boxes while I watched. They had thrown a party in my living room and seated me in a corner like discarded furniture. Lauren had looked at me with casual contempt, and Richard had discussed knocking down walls where my wife took her final breath. Whatever financial pressure they faced, it did not give them the right to erase my dignity. She was not just greedy, I thought. She was terrified. But terror does not excuse cruelty. Desperation does not justify dehumanization. Something shifted inside me as I sat there in the fading afternoon light. It was not sympathy exactly, not forgiveness. It was something more complicated. A recognition that the people who had hurt me were also suffering, that the world contained pain I had not seen, that my revenge would land on shoulders already buckling under invisible weight. None of that changed my course. The house was sold, the decision was made, but I would carry this knowledge forward, let it shape whatever came next. The house was sold. The Millers' last hope had vanished, snatched away by a quiet transaction they never saw coming, and they still had no idea. In 48 hours, they would find out that the ground beneath their feet had turned to sand. I was not there when the notice arrived. I had moved into a small furnished apartment across town 3 days earlier, slipping away while the Millers were out celebrating some occasion I had not been invited to. I left no forwarding address, no explanation, just empty closets and bare walls where my presence used to be. Sam had arranged everything, finding me temporary housing that was modest but peaceful, a place where I could wait for the final act to unfold. I learned what happened next through a combination of sources. Sam's contacts, public records, and eventually the flood of voicemails that filled my phone in the days that followed. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by certified mail that required a signature. Lauren signed for it without thinking, probably assuming it was some routine document related to the renovations she had been planning. She carried it inside, set down her purse, and opened it while standing in the kitchen. The letterhead belonged to a law firm she did not recognize. The subject line read, "Notice to vacate." The body of the letter explained in precise legal language that the property had been sold and that all current occupants were required to leave within 30 days. The The new owners intended to take possession on the specified date. Any personal belongings remaining after that time would be considered abandoned. According to what I later pieced together, Lauren read the notice 3 times before the words began to make sense. Even then, she did not believe it. She could not believe it. How could the house be sold when she had been living in it, when she had been planning its future, when no one had ever mentioned a sale? She called the title company first, demanding answers, her voice climbing with each unanswered question. The representative confirmed that the property had indeed changed hands. A clean transaction completed without complications. The previous owner had exercised his legal right to sell. Lauren hung up and called the bank, next then a real estate attorney whose number she found online. Every call produced the same answer. The sale was legitimate. The notice was valid. There was nothing to contest, nothing to appeal, nothing to undo. Then she called me. 89 times over the next 2 days, according to my phone's log. I did not answer a single call. I let each one ring through to voicemail, listening later to the progression of her emotional state. The first messages were confused, almost polite, asking me to call back and explain what must surely be some misunderstanding. The next batch turned angry, accusing me of trickery, of betrayal, of senile incompetence. Then came the desperate ones, the ones where her voice cracked and her words tumbled over each other in panic. By the end, she was simply crying into the phone, unable to form coherent sentences, begging for someone to tell her this was not happening. Panic spread through the Miller family like wildfire. Richard arrived at the condo within hours of Lauren's discovery, his face gray with shock, his hands trembling as he read the notice himself. The foreclosure hearing for his remaining property was now just 12 days away. He had been counting on the condo as a backup plan, a place to retreat if everything else collapsed. Now that refuge had vanished. Elaine followed soon after, her composure cracking under the weight of this new catastrophe. Jason came too, though his 1-bedroom apartment could barely hold his own furniture, let alone 5 additional people with nowhere else to go. What followed was a reckoning I did not witness but could easily imagine. The family that had worked so smoothly together to claim my home now turned on each other with equal ferocity. Lauren screamed at Richard. "You said we had time," she shouted, according to neighbors who heard the commotion through thin walls. "You said this would fix everything. You promised," Richard shouted back, deflecting blame, pointing fingers at Lauren's handling of the situation, at Jason's failed business ventures, at everyone except himself. Elaine wept and wrung her hands, offering no solutions, only recriminations. The united front they had presented at Christmas dinner shattered into fragments of accusation and despair. I returned to the condo once during that chaotic period, on a day when I knew they would be out dealing with lawyers and banks. I wanted to collect a few items I had left behind. Small things with sentimental value that I could not bear to lose. What I found stopped me in the doorway. The living room was cluttered with boxes they had never finished unpacking. Paint samples still sat on the counter, waiting for decisions that would never be made. Furniture had been rearranged according to Lauren's vision, positioned for a life that would not happen. And there on the kitchen table lay the notice. It was creased and worn from handling the paper, soft from being read and reread, and clutched in desperate hands. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the chaos of abandoned plans. For months they had treated me like I was already dead. They had erased me from my own home, packed my life into boxes, and celebrated their victory while I sat invisible in the corner. Now they understood what it felt like to be erased. The empire of arrogance that Lauren had built so confidently had its first deep crack, and through that crack I could see the fear she had been hiding all along. Not the fear of losing a house, the fear of losing everything. I collected my belongings and left without disturbing anything else. On the drive back to my apartment, I finally checked my voicemail. 89 missed calls, dozens of messages ranging from confusion to rage to desperation. I listened to a few, just enough to understand the shape of their panic. Then I came to one that made me pull the car to the side of the road. It was not from Lauren or Richard or any of the Millers. It was from Daniel. And what he said changed everything I thought I knew about my son. For months they had treated me like I was already dead. Now they understood what it felt like to be erased. But this was not the end of their story or mine, because among those 89 missed calls was one message that would change everything I thought I knew about my son. My new apartment was nothing like the condo. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, a living room barely large enough for a couch and a television. The walls were painted a neutral beige that reminded me of hospital waiting rooms. The furniture came with the rental functional pieces without history or memory. But for the first time in months, I could breathe. The air felt clean, uncontaminated by schemes and whispered plans and the slow erosion of my dignity. I sat by the window on that Thursday evening watching the sun set over unfamiliar streets and finally allowed myself to feel something other than vigilance. Then I turned to my phone and the 89 missed calls waiting there. I scrolled through them, methodically reading names and timestamps, reconstructing the timeline of panic I had unleashed. Lauren's calls came in clusters, sometimes 5 or 6, within a single hour, her desperation escalating with each unanswered ring. Elaine called too, her voicemails thick with guilt and manufactured concern. She spoke about family and forgiveness and how I must be confused, how surely we could work this out if I would just talk to them. Richard left fewer messages, but the ones he did leave carried an edge of threat. He mentioned lawyers and elder abuse and competency hearings, grasping at any weapon he thought might wound me. I deleted each message without listening to the end. These people had nothing left to say that I needed to hear. Then I came to a voicemail from Daniel. I almost deleted it without listening. My thumb hovered over the button ready to dismiss my son's voice along with all the others, but something made me pause. The timestamp showed he had called hours after everyone else late at night when the chaos would have been at its peak. And the preview text showed a duration of nearly 3 minutes, far longer than any other message. Curiosity won over caution. I pressed play and raised the phone to my ear. "Dad," his voice began, and immediately I could hear the difference. He did not sound angry or desperate or manipulative. He sounded exhausted, like a man who had been carrying a weight for far too long. "Before you delete this, please listen. Check your old email, the one Mom used to send you recipes. I've been trying to reach you since Christmas. Everything I sent is there. Please, Dad, just look, then decide what you think of me." The message ended. I sat in the growing darkness staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what I had heard. The old email account. Maggie's account, the one she used to share recipes and family photos and little notes that made ordinary days feel special. I had not logged in since she died. The thought of seeing her name in my inbox, of reading messages she would never send again, had been too painful to bear. But Daniel's voice carried something I'd not expected. Not guilt, not excuses. Something that sounded almost like hope. I found my laptop and opened it for the first time in weeks. My hands trembled slightly as I typed the old email address, then the password Maggie had used for everything. The inbox loaded slowly, filled with years of unread newsletters and promotional offers. But Daniel had mentioned the spam folder specifically. I clicked on it and watched as the contents loaded. 47 messages, all from Daniel. The earliest dated from December 26th, the day after Christmas dinner. I opened the first one with my heart pounding against my ribs. It contained an audio file and a brief note. "Dad, I recorded this today. Lauren thinks I support her plan. I do not. But if I confront her directly, she will take the kids and disappear. I have seen her do it before with her last job when things went wrong. So I am documenting everything instead. Every conversation, every meeting, every detail. When you are ready to fight back, you will have proof. I'm sorry I cannot do more. I'm sorry I have to pretend. Please do not give up on me." I played the audio file. It was a recording of Lauren discussing strategy with her parents, their voices clear and damning, laying out exactly how they planned to pressure me into compliance. The quality was perfect. Daniel must have positioned his phone carefully, capturing every word while pretending to be complicit in their scheme. I opened the next message and the next and the next. Each one contained more evidence. Screenshots of text conversations between Lauren and her family. Transcripts of phone calls she thought were private. Photographs of documents she had shown only to her inner circle. Daniel had built a comprehensive record of every step in their conspiracy, a paper trail that would have destroyed them in any court if I had ever needed it. He had been working in secret for months, risking his marriage and his relationship with his children, gathering ammunition for a war I didn't know he was fighting. As I read through the messages, memories began to shift and rearrange themselves. The crumpled note Daniel slipped me after Christmas telling me to check this very email. I dismissed it as nothing. Now I understood it was his first desperate attempt to reach me. The phone he positioned so carefully on the shelf while Lauren discussed paint colors, screen facing outward. I thought he was ashamed to watch. He was recording everything. His absence from the housewarming party that Lauren explained away as work. He could not bring himself to celebrate a crime he was secretly documenting. The strange text from an unknown number telling me not to give up on him. A final plea sent from a phone Lauren did not know about, hoping against hope that I would understand. Every moment I had interpreted as betrayal revealed itself as loyalty. Every silence I read as weakness showed itself as strategy. My son had not abandoned me. He had been fighting for me in the only way he could, trapped between a wife who would destroy him and a father he could not bear to lose. He did what I taught him all those years ago on construction sites when problems seemed impossible. He measured twice. He gathered evidence. He waited for me to make the first cut. I sat there as darkness filled the apartment, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of grief this time, not tears of loss. These were tears of something I thought I had lost forever. Faith. My son had not betrayed me. He had been my silent soldier all along, gathering weapons in the shadows, waiting for the moment when his father would need them most. I had misjudged him completely. I had nearly deleted his message without listening. I had almost thrown away the proof of his love. The phone felt warm in my hand as I found his number. It was time to bring my son home. Daniel answered on the first ring, as if he had been holding his phone for hours waiting for this exact call. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence stretched across the connection, heavy with everything that needed to be said and the uncertainty of where to begin. Finally, I heard him exhale a shaky breath that carried years of tension. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on that single syllable. "You found the emails?" I told him I had. I told him I had read every message, listened to every recording, studied every piece of evidence he had gathered. Then I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind since I first understood what he had done. "Why did you not just tell me? Why all the secrecy, all the hidden messages and anonymous texts? Why did you let me believe you had abandoned me?" The explanation came slowly, painfully, each word chosen with care. Daniel described a situation more complicated than I had understood from the outside. Lauren, he said, was not simply greedy or ambitious. She was controlling in ways that had taken him years to recognize. When she felt threatened, she retaliated. He had seen it happen before at her previous job when a colleague challenged her authority. She had systematically destroyed that person's reputation, turning friends into enemies, manufacturing evidence of incompetence, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. When their marriage began to struggle, she had made it clear that any divorce would be brutal. She would take the children, disappear to another state, bury him in legal battles he could not afford to fight. He had spent years walking on eggshells, trying to protect what little stability remained. When the plan to take my condo emerged, Daniel faced an impossible choice. If he confronted Lauren directly, she would turn on him. She would spin the story to make him look unstable, paint me as a confused old man being manipulated by a disloyal son, and use her family's resources to wage war on both of us. Worse, she might take the children and vanish before anyone could stop her. He had no legal standing to prevent the plan, no authority to overrule his wife's decisions about where they would live. The only power he had was information. So he did what he had learned from watching me work all those years ago. He observed. He documented. He built a case piece by piece, hoping that when the moment came, his father would know what to do with it. I listened without interrupting, letting his words fill the spaces between us. When he finished, the silence returned, but it felt different now, less hostile, more like the quiet between two people trying to find their footing on unfamiliar ground. There was something else I needed to address, something that had been sitting between us for a decade, unspoken but never forgotten. "I knew about the signature," I said. "The one you forged 10 years ago. I always knew." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear Daniel breathing on the other end of the line, quick, shallow breaths that spoke of sudden fear. When he finally responded, his voice was barely a whisper. "How long?" "Since the week after you did it," I told him. I found the bank statement. I compared the signatures. It was not hard to figure out. Another long pause. Then the question I'd been waiting a decade to answer. Why did you never say anything? I had asked myself that same question countless times over the years. The answer was complicated, tangled up in love and hope and the desperate wish to believe the best about people we care for. "Because I hoped you would tell me yourself," I said, "because I wanted to believe it was desperation, not character. You were in trouble. You made a terrible choice. I convinced myself it was a one-time mistake, that the son I raised was still in there somewhere. But I was wrong to stay silent, Daniel. I taught you that betrayal had no cost. I let you believe that taking from me carried no consequences. Maybe if I had confronted you, then things would have been different now. Daniel's response came through tears I could hear but not see. "You should have told me," he said. "I would have been angry. I would have been ashamed, but at least we would have been honest with each other. Instead, I spent 10 years wondering if you knew, afraid to ask, carrying the guilt like a stone in my chest." And then Lauren came along, and she saw how easy it was for me to look the other way when people did wrong things. She used that. She trained me to be complicit, and I let her, because I had already learned how. The honesty of that admission struck me harder than any accusation could have. My son was not making excuses. He was taking responsibility not just for the recent crisis, but for the patterns that had made it possible. Something in my chest loosened a knot I had been carrying for longer than I realized, but I was not ready to pretend everything was resolved. Too much had happened for easy reconciliation. "You are my son," I said carefully. "Nothing changes that. Nothing ever could. But Daniel, you enabled her for months before you started recording. You watched them pack my belongings. You let them throw a party in my living room while I sat in the corner like a stranger. The documentation was brave. The silence before it was cowardice. We do not rebuild overnight. I know," he said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice. "I know I was weak. I know I waited too long to act. I do not deserve fast forgiveness, Dad. I'm not asking for that. I just want a chance to be the son Mom believed I could be, a chance to prove that the man who gathered that evidence is more real than the man who stood by and watched." We talked for another hour after that, covering ground we had avoided for years. We spoke about Maggie, about the hole her death had left in both our lives, about the ways grief had pushed us apart when it should have drawn us together. We spoke about the children, about Daniel's fears for their future, about the kind of grandfather I wanted to be, and the kind of father he was struggling to become. We did not solve everything. We did not heal every wound, but we started something that night, a foundation laid in truth rather than comfortable silence. When we finally said goodbye, my apartment felt different. The beige walls seemed warmer somehow, the sparse furniture less lonely. This was not the reunion I had imagined. There was no dramatic embrace, no tears of joy, no swelling music to mark the moment. It was something better. It was honest. And honesty, I was learning, was the only foundation that could hold the weight of what came next. The weeks that followed brought news of the Miller family in fragments, pieces of a collapse I observed from a distance. Sam kept me informed through his network of contacts, and Daniel shared what he witnessed firsthand before the final break. What I learned confirmed something I had suspected for a long time. Desperation does not build alliances, it builds time bombs. And when the Millers' last hopes detonated, they tore each other apart with the same ferocity they had once directed at me. Richard's foreclosure hearing came and went with brutal efficiency. The judge showed no sympathy for a man who had overextended himself through reckless investments and refused to acknowledge his circumstances until it was far too late. His remaining rental property was seized along with what little equity remained. The accounts were frozen, the creditors circled. In the span of a single afternoon, Richard Miller went from patriarch of a scheming family to a man with nothing left to leverage. He returned to Jason's cramped apartment that evening and reportedly did not speak for 3 days. When he finally did, it was only to assign blame. Elaine became the chorus of accusation. She blamed Richard for poor decisions, blamed Jason for not providing adequate shelter, blamed Lauren for the failed plan that was supposed to save them all. She never once looked inward, never acknowledged her own role in the emotional manipulation that had kept their scheme moving forward. In her version of events, she was merely a supportive mother caught up in circumstances beyond her control. The guilt belonged to everyone except the woman who had whispered about selfishness and family duty while her daughter dismantled my dignity piece by piece. Jason's one-bedroom apartment was never designed to hold 5 adults in crisis. 600 square feet became a pressure cooker of resentment and recrimination. Every shared meal sparked conflict. Every closed bathroom door triggered complaints. The family that had moved so smoothly together when they had a common target now had nothing to unite them except mutual frustration. Arguments erupted daily over trivial matters that masked deeper wounds. The television volume, the thermostat setting, who had used the last of the milk without replacing it. These were not real grievances. They were proxies for the rage everyone felt, but no one could properly direct. Lauren and Daniel separated 2 weeks after the eviction notice arrived. According to my son, she could not bear to look at him knowing he had witnessed her humiliation. Every glance reminded her of how completely her plans had failed, how thoroughly her assumptions had been proven wrong. She moved into her parents' corner of Jason's apartment, taking the children with her, and communication between them dwindled to terse messages about logistics. Daniel found temporary housing with a college friend and began the slow process of rebuilding a life that had been defined for too long by accommodation and fear. He told me during one of our now regular phone calls that the separation felt less like loss and more like finally being able to breathe. I understood exactly what he meant. Sam called me on a Tuesday afternoon with a proposal I had been expecting. He laid out the legal options with his characteristic precision. I had grounds for civil action, he explained. Emotional distress, attempted elder exploitation, possibly fraud depending on how aggressively we wanted to pursue certain conversations that Daniel's recordings had captured. He could make their lives very difficult if I wanted. He could tie them up in litigation for years, drain whatever resources they managed to scrape together, ensure that the consequences of their actions followed them like shadows for decades to come. I listened carefully, letting the possibilities settle over me. Part of me wanted it. The old anger still burned, banked, but not extinguished, ready to flare at the slightest provocation. I thought about Lauren supervising the packing of my belongings. I thought about Richard measuring walls in the room where Maggie died. I thought about Elaine invoking my wife's memory as a weapon against me. These people had earned whatever punishment the legal system could deliver. Justice would not be cruelty. It would simply be consequence. But something else burned brighter than anger. I could not name it at first. It felt like exhaustion, like the weariness that comes after a long illness finally breaks. I had spent months watching, planning, executing a strategy that required constant vigilance. The weight of that sustained attention had settled into my bones. Did I really want to carry it further? Did I want to spend the next several years of my life focused on people who had already lost everything that mattered to them? No lawsuits, I told Sam. No criminal charges. They have lost their home, their dignity, their family unity. Richard is ruined. Lauren's marriage is over. They are 5 bitter people, crammed into an apartment designed for one, tearing each other apart because there is no one else left to blame. Making them suffer more does not give me anything back. It just keeps me tethered to them when what I want most is to be free. Sam was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him processing my decision, recalibrating his assumptions. He was a good lawyer trained to pursue every advantage, and my choice probably struck him as strategically unsound. But when he spoke again, his voice carried respect rather than disagreement. He said he understood. He said he would close the file and move forward with whatever I needed next. He said Maggie would have been proud. That last comment stayed with me after we ended the call. Maggie used to say that revenge was drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I never fully understood what she meant until now. The Millers were already suffering. Extending their pain would not heal my wounds. It would only keep those wounds open, fresh and bleeding, demanding attention that could be spent on better things. I would rather build something new than tear down what remained of them. But I was not quite finished. There was one more piece of unfinished business done. Final thread that connected me to the woman who had tried to destroy me. I walked to my desk and opened the drawer where I had placed Maggie's envelope all those weeks ago. The letter addressed to Lauren sat there, waiting, patient as ever, holding words I still had not read. I picked it up and felt its familiar weight. I finally understood why my wife had written it. Maggie saw things in people that others missed. She had recognized something in Lauren long before I did, something that required not punishment, but a different kind of reckoning. I didn't know what the letter said, but I knew it was time to deliver it. Justice had been served. The Millers had paid their price, but Maggie had left one final gift, not for me, but for the woman who had hurt me most, and I had a feeling that gift would cut deeper than any lawsuit ever could. I called Lauren 3 days later and asked her to meet me. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wariness I had never heard before. The confident woman who had orchestrated my displacement was gone. In her place was someone braced for impact, expecting another blow in a series that had already brought her to her knees. She asked what I wanted. I told her I had something that belonged to her, something Maggie had left behind. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and Jason's place, neutral ground, where neither of us would have the advantage. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a cup she had not touched. The change in her appearance startled me. The polished professional who had directed the packing of my life was gone. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. Her clothes looked slept in. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had taken on the grayish pallor of someone who had stopped caring about appearances. She watched me approach with the guarded expression of an animal that had been cornered too many times. I sat across from her without ordering anything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The coffee shop hummed around us with the ordinary sounds of people living ordinary lives, a soundtrack that felt almost absurd given the weight of what hung between us. Lauren broke first. She asked why I wanted to see her, what possible purpose this meeting could serve. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to hide. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope. It was worn now from handling the edges, soft. Maggie's handwriting slightly faded but still clearly legible. Lauren's name stood out against the cream-colored paper written with the care my wife brought to everything important. I placed it on the table between us and slid it toward her. "Maggie wrote this for you," I said. "I never opened it. I do not know what it says. She wanted you to have it, so here it is." Lauren stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. She made no move to pick it up. Her eyes flickered between the letter and my face, searching for the trap, the hidden cruelty, the punishment that surely must be embedded in this gesture. I could see her mind working, trying to calculate what angle I was playing, what advantage I hoped to gain. The idea that I might simply be delivering a message without ulterior motive seemed beyond her comprehension. I stood to leave. Whatever was in that letter was between Lauren and my wife. I'd carried it long enough. The rest was not my business. "Wait," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, stay." I hesitated, then sat back down. She picked up the envelope with trembling fingers, turning it over, examining the seal that had remained unbroken for years. Then she opened it carefully as if the paper itself might shatter, and unfolded the letter inside. I watched her eyes move across the words, saw her expression shift from suspicion to confusion to something I could not name. Her lips began to move silently at first. Then she started reading aloud, her voice breaking on every other word. "Dear Lauren," she read, "if you are reading this, my husband is hurting, and you are probably the reason. I do not know what you have done, but I think I know why. You are afraid. I saw it the first time we met, that hunger in your eyes, the desperate need to prove yourself worthy. I recognized it because I felt it once too." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Tears had begun to stream down her face, cutting tracks through whatever makeup she had bothered to apply. She took a shaky breath and continued. "Taking from others will not fill that emptiness. It never does. I spent years learning that the hard way. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is too heavy for an old woman's heart. I hope one day you will understand that love is not something you take. It is something you build. The door is not closed, Lauren, but you have to knock honestly this time. Maggie." The letter fell from her hands as she broke down completely. This was not the controlled crying of someone performing grief for an audience. This was the raw, ugly sobbing of a person whose defenses had finally crumbled. She buried her face in her hands and wept with her whole body, shoulders heaving, breath coming in ragged gasps. The other customers glanced over with concern, but I ignored them. This moment was not about appearances or judgment. It was about something far more personal. I watched Lauren cry and felt something I had not expected. It was not satisfaction. It was not pity. It was not even forgiveness, not yet. It was a strange kind of peace, the sensation of a burden being lifted that I had not realized I was carrying. Maggie had seen something in this woman that I had missed entirely. She had looked past the ambition and the manipulation and the casual cruelty, and she had found the frightened person hiding underneath. She had written this letter not to punish, but to offer a lifeline, a possibility of redemption that required nothing from me except delivery. When Lauren's sobs finally subsided, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. How did she know? She whispered. We barely spoke. How could she possibly have known I did not have an answer? Maggie saw things in people. She always had. It was one of her gifts, one I had benefited from my entire adult life without ever fully appreciating. She had seen something worth saving in Lauren, even knowing what Lauren might one day do. That kind of vision was beyond me. But I could honor it. "I cannot forgive you yet," I said quietly. "I do not know if I ever will. What you did to me, what you tried to take, the way you made me feel like a ghost in my own home. Those wounds do not heal quickly. But Maggie could forgive you. She did forgive you years before you even committed the sin. Maybe that is enough for now. Maybe her grace can hold the space until I figure out what mine looks like. I stood again, and this time Lauren did not ask me to stay. She sat clutching the letter like a lifeline, tears still wet on her cheeks, looking smaller and more human than I had ever seen her. I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. Revenge would have been easy. Cruelty would have felt justified. But Maggie taught me something harder. She taught me the courage to offer grace when it is not deserved. I walked out of that coffee shop lighter than I had felt in years. Not because justice was served, not because I had won, but because I had finally let it go. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that coffee shop. The calendar has turned from winter to spring to the golden edge of summer, and with each passing season, the weight I carried has grown lighter. I live in a modest apartment now, 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a quiet building near a park where children play on weekends and elderly couples walk hand in hand along shaded paths. The space is smaller than the condo, simpler than the home I shared with Maggie for all those years. But it is entirely my own. Every piece of furniture was chosen by me. Every photograph on the walls holds memories I want to keep. No one is measuring these rooms for renovation. No one is packing my belongings into boxes. When I wake each morning, I know exactly where I am and exactly who I am. That certainty is worth more than square footage. Daniel comes every Sunday with the grandchildren. We have lunch together, simple meals I prepare myself, nothing fancy but made with care. The children have adjusted to the new arrangement with the resilience that only young people possess. They do not fully understand what happened between their parents, and we do not burden them with explanations they are too young to process. They know that Grandpa has a new apartment and that Daddy visits separately from Mommy now. That is enough for them. They bring drawings they made at school and stories about friends and questions about everything under the sun. I answer, as best I can, grateful for each moment of connection. Daniel and I are rebuilding slowly, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. We do not pretend the past did not happen. We talk about it sometimes carefully, acknowledging the wounds without picking at them. He has started therapy to understand the patterns that made him vulnerable to someone like Lauren. I have started to examine my own role in those patterns, the ways my silence enabled behavior I should have confronted. We are both learning. We are both growing. The relationship we are building now is different from what we had before, more honest, more intentional. It may never be what it was when he was a boy, looking up at his father with uncomplicated admiration. But it might become something stronger, forged in truth, rather than assumption. 3 months ago, I joined a support group for elderly victims of family financial abuse. I found them through a flyer at the community center, a small notice that caught my eye while I was signing up for a woodworking class. The group meets every Thursday evening in the basement of a church, a dozen of us sitting in a circle on folding chairs sharing stories that would break your heart. There is a woman whose daughter stole her entire retirement fund through a power of attorney she did not understand. There is a man whose grandchildren manipulated him into signing over his house by threatening to cut off contact. There are widows and widowers, parents and grandparents, people who loved too much and trusted too easily and paid terrible prices for their generosity. I listen to their stories, and I share my own. The first time I spoke, my voice trembled so badly I could barely get the words out. Now I speak clearly with purpose, knowing that my experience might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it is too late. I have become a volunteer advocate for the organization that runs the group. I visit senior centers and community gatherings talking about financial exploitation, explaining the tactics that predators use, teaching people how to protect themselves without becoming cynical or closed off. I spent 40 years building bridges across rivers. Now I build them across silence. Every conversation matters. Every person who learns to recognize manipulation before it destroys them is a victory worth celebrating. I am not alone anymore. I have found purpose in helping others avoid the pain I endured. Last week I visited Maggie's grave with fresh flowers. Yellow roses, her favorites, bright against the gray stone that bears her name. I sat on the grass beside her marker and talked for a long time, telling her everything that had happened since Christmas. The discovery of her trust, the sale of the condo, the revelation about Daniel, the letter she left for Lauren. I told her about the coffee shop, about watching her words break through armor I could never have penetrated on my own. I told her about the peace I felt walking away, the lightness that has stayed with me ever since. "You knew," I said to the stone. You knew I would need that letter for Lauren more than I needed revenge. You always were 10 steps ahead of me, Maggie. Even now, even gone, you are still teaching me things I should have learned decades ago." The breeze stirred the roses as if she were answering. I touched the headstone, gently tracing the letters of her name with my fingertips. "I finally understand what you meant about boundaries," I told her. "They are not walls to keep people out. They are foundations to build something new." If you are listening to this story and seeing yourself in it, I want you to know something. Maybe you are the parent who gives too much, who sacrifices until there is nothing left, who cannot say no to children who have learned to take without gratitude. Maybe you are the elder who has been made to feel invisible, whose opinions no longer matter, whose presence is tolerated rather than treasured. Maybe you are the person whose kindness has been mistaken for weakness, whose generosity has been exploited, whose love has been weaponized against you. I want you to know that you are not alone, and I want you to know that there is another way. You are not a burden. You are not expired. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Your worth is not measured in what you can provide. Your value does not decrease with age. You deserve respect not because of what you give, but because of who you are. Boundaries are not betrayal. Silence can be strategy, and sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is choose themselves. I did not get my old life back. I got something better, a new life built on my own terms with people who earned their place in it through honesty and effort rather than obligation and guilt. The condo is gone, but I'm still here. The family I thought I had dissolved, but a truer one is taking its place. Maggie is no longer beside me, but her wisdom guides me every day. She used to say that the strongest bridges are not the ones that never bend. They are the ones that bend without breaking. I bent. I nearly broke, but I'm still standing, and so are you. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. It is waking up one morning and realizing you are finally free. And that is where Thomas's story ends, but I hope the lessons from his journey stay with you long after this video is over. I have shared hundreds of stories on this channel, stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice. But Thomas's story stands out for one simple reason. It is not really about revenge at all. It is about something much harder to achieve. It is about freedom. What strikes me most is not that Thomas won, it is how he won. He had every right to destroy the Miller family completely. He had recordings, documents, testimony from his own son. He could have dragged them through court for years. He could have made sure they never recovered. The law was on his side. Morality was on his side. Most of us would have cheered him on if he had chosen that path. But Thomas understood something that took me years to learn. Revenge is a chain. The moment you commit to destroying someone else, you bind yourself to them. Every court date, every legal filing, every update on their suffering becomes another link in that chain. Thomas did not want to spend the rest of his life connected to people who had tried to erase him. So he chose peace over punishment. He chose freedom over victory. And that takes more strength than most people will ever understand. Now let me speak directly to those of you who see yourselves in this story. Maybe you are the parent who has given everything to your children and now feels like a burden in return. Maybe you are the grandparent whose home is being eyed by family members who talk about your future as if you are already gone. Maybe you are the widow or widower whose loneliness has made you vulnerable to people who smell opportunity in your grief. I want you to hear me clearly. You are not a burden. Your home is yours, your savings are yours, your independence is yours, and no amount of guilt or manipulation changes that fact. Here's what I want you to take away from Thomas's story. First, silence is only powerful when it is strategic. Do not stay quiet because you are afraid of conflict. Stay quiet because you are gathering information and waiting for the right moment to act. Second document. Everything. Every conversation, every promise, every threat. Save every text message and email. You never know when that evidence will save you. Third, talk to a lawyer before you sign anything. A few $100s in legal fees can save you hundreds of thousands in losses. Fourth, remember that saying no is not selfish. It is survival. You are allowed to protect yourself. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom. But also remember what Maggie taught Thomas. Revenge might feel good in the moment, but freedom feels better for a lifetime. The goal is not to destroy the people who hurt you. The goal is to build a life where they no longer have power over you. Thomas won because he walked away whole with his dignity intact, ready to start again on his own terms. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story of family betrayal and quiet justice, leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, this is Revenge Room. Stay strong, stay smart, protect what is yours, and never let anyone make you feel invisible in your own life.